Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 35. So stay tuned, everyone, for our final chapter of the structure of biblical authority. Well, welcome back to the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be with you again.
So just our regular housekeeping before we dive into this, our final chapter of the structure of biblical authority. We do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There we have the material that we have talked about in the episode. We link to articles and other items as we can. We are continuing to get 5-star ratings on iTunes. We really, really appreciate that. Please keep those coming if you haven't done so already. I will include another link to how to do that in the show notes. And also, we do have our donation button on the show notes page, but if you would like to give directly to the podcast without having PayPal take a cut, you can simply send directly from your PayPal account to us. If you have any problems with that, please email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. And before we dive right in, I would like to plug one of Lee's books. I bought it months ago, but I've just started using it for a project that I'm working on. It is a syntax guide for readers of the Greek New Testament. So if you are a seminary student, if you know a seminary student, or if you're a pastor or know a pastor, this would be great either for yourself or as a gift for one of those people. Really makes reading through the text so much easier. Because if you get stuck on a word, Lee's got it right there to explain its grammatical relation to the rest of the sentence that it's in. Highly recommend that. You can find it on Amazon.com. Okay, today we are in part 2 of Structure of Biblical Authority, Chapter 4, The Old Testament Origins of the Gospel Genre. Another exciting chapter, some groundbreaking work by Meredith Kline. So, what's going on in this chapter, Lee?
So this chapter was added in the second edition of the Structure of Biblical Authority. It was originally published in the Westminster Theological Journal as a separate article, and then in the second edition, Kline added it to the book. So there are 2 editions of the book out there. Sometimes people will find the first edition on a used bookstore, online store, or eBay or something like that, and they'll be shocked to find out that it's lacking this last chapter. So, but if you are in that situation where you have a first edition and you would like to get this last chapter, you can simply go to the Meredith Kline website and download the article itself as a standalone article.
Okay, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So this chapter is basically a follow-up on a brief comment that Kline had made earlier in the book. So if you recall back in chapter 2 of the book, chapter 2 of part 1, Kline had a chapter called Covenantal Bible, where he simply goes through all of the genres of the Old and the New Testaments, and he tries to connect each of those genres to the covenant structure. And he has a brief comment on page 72 where he says that the gospel narratives are basically focused on the inauguration of the new covenant. And so we could view the gospels as basically testimonies to the ratification of the covenant. So here in this chapter, he follows up on that thought that the Gospels are covenant witness documents. That is, they're documents witnessing to the making of the covenant. And he fleshes it out and says we can use this covenantal context, this covenantal approach to this covenantal lens to understanding the Bible as a way of getting at the essential nature and purpose of the Gospels.
Okay. So, given the title of this chapter, the Old Testament origins of the gospel genre, he's going to connect what makes up the New Testament gospel as a piece of literature to something in the Old Testament using this covenant document theme.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right. So the first thing that Kline does in this chapter is he surveys some of the attempts that are out there in the scholarly literature on this issue, attempts to try to define what is the genre of the Gospels. This is a question that has plagued scholars for a long time because the Gospels are so unique. And so it's been a struggle for scholars to try to identify what is the genre of the four Gospels. Some say it's biography, but Kline says, well, there's some truth to that, but the Gospels don't just focus on the life of Jesus. They also contain large sections on the teachings of Jesus. And biographies don't normally include that kind of, you don't have like the Sermon on the Mount,
right,
in a typical biography. So there's something unique here. He also talks about form criticism, which was a very popular approach to interpreting the Gospels earlier in the 20th century, in which each pericope, that's a paragraph, each pericope is analyzed as a unit that somehow could be traced back to the life of the early church. Like you could say, well, this particular story here, or this parable, or this unit is, it comes out of the liturgy of the church, or it comes out of a situation in which the church is performing exorcisms. And so they created the story about Jesus doing it in order to authenticate and authorize what they're doing in the church now. Kline rejects that because it attributes too much creativity to the church, as if the church just basically made up all these stories about Jesus out of thin air without any historical basis.
Okay.
And then he points out that there are some conservative critics who want to argue, and I would say this is probably the more common view today, that the Gospels are a literary novelty. In other words, that there is no genre. There is no pre-existing genre out there that the Gospels would fit into. The genre is a unique genre called a gospel, and it's created, precisely. It arose precisely because of the uniqueness of Christ himself. His own person and ministry is so unique that it gave rise to a brand new literary genre that didn't exist before.
So as a New Testament scholar, would you say that this idea that the Gospels are a literary novelty would be the dominant view in conservative scholarship?
I think so. I think that there's a tendency in that direction. Okay. I think that there's also a lot of scholars are also looking at the biography as a helpful way of looking at the Gospels. But Kline is going to argue something completely different that I'm not aware of any other scholar arguing for, and that is that the gospel genre is not brand new, but actually it arises from the Old Testament.
It's exciting how he does that. Yeah.
So he's going to argue that basically the book of Exodus is the fountain from which the gospel genre arose.
Right. That both Exodus and the Synoptics and John are all of the same gospel genre.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So he basically gets this off the ground by pointing out that this idea of writing new literature within a Jewish context that is actually borrowed from an existing Old Testament genre is not something new. So he points out, for example, that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain some interesting examples, not of gospel genre, but of using an Old Testament genre and then writing new literature that would fit in it. So,
Okay.
for example, there are in the Qumran sectarian literature within the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are apocalypses, there are historical narratives, there's also Psalms. They're called the Hodayot in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are Psalms written in Hebrew that contain very similar language, poetic structure, and themes to the biblical Psalms. And so Kline is arguing, look, we shouldn't be surprised then if the genre of the Gospels in the New Testament is a very similar phenomenon of something where the New Testament writers are looking to an Old Testament pattern and then writing within that pattern, but then updating it and making something new based upon this new event in redemptive history, which is, of course, the coming of the Messiah.
Right. So his thesis is pretty straightforward. Basically, that the book of Exodus is an Old Testament gospel document, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Let's see.
He even sees some of the same themes and some of the same structuring between Exodus and the New Testament Gospels.
Right. And he even gets pretty granular in his analysis of similarities or parallels between them.
Mm-hmm.
So
one of the key things that he points out is this whole issue of both the Gospels and the book of Exodus contain two types of literature, history and law.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Gospels, you have history, obviously. You have all the events of the life of Jesus. But you also have law in the sense that you have those teachings of Jesus, like the Sermon on the Mount, that are very didactic, and it's the instruction aspect. And so you see the same thing in the book of Exodus. Obviously, you have the whole first half of the book, chapters 1 through 18, is the story of how Israel was in bondage in Egypt and how God delivered them and brought them to Mount Sinai. But then you have the second half, which is so heavily dominated by law and the giving of the instructions for the covenant people.
And that distinction really is why he's not comfortable with biography as the category for either Exodus or the Gospels, right?
Right, exactly.
Because biography tends not to include law the way that both Exodus and the Gospels do.
Right.
Okay. And he also rejects the form critical JEDP analysis in this regard too.
Right. Yeah. So JEDP, the documentary hypothesis for the origin of the Pentateuch, would say that there are four sources: J, the Yahwist; E, the Elohist; D, the Deuteronomist; and P, the priestly writings. And so if you have that, if you approach the book of Exodus from that methodology, then the way you would explain the fact that there are these two major types of literature within the book of Exodus is you would say, well, this over here, this historical strand, this narrative, that's maybe the Yahwist or the Elohist or the Deuteronomist. But then when you look at the law section and all the detailed prescriptions and the case laws, well, clearly that's the priestly, because the priests were the ones that were so concerned about legalistic details. And so that's how you would explain the two major elements of the book of Exodus. Kline says, no, we don't need to go down that path. Instead, we could see the two major strands of Exodus as being related to the treaty format.
Right.
So the treaty format, which is the preamble, the historical prologue, the stipulations, the sanctions, and the documentary clause, well, sections 2 and 3, historical prologue, that gives you history, and stipulations, that gives you the law. So there you have it. You could just see the book of Exodus then as being based upon the treaty format itself. Now, Kline is going to make a very interesting statement here. He's going to say, look, the book of Exodus itself is not a treaty.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's so heavily influenced by the treaty and is talking about the treaty, as a result of that, the book of Exodus is what he calls a byform of the treaty genre. So it's kind of like a subordinate literary form that is like a stepchild of the treaty genre.
Okay.
And so that's why it contains treaty-like elements, even though in and of itself it's not a treaty.
Interesting.
Or maybe another way to put it is that it's a document that is containing the record of the making of the treaty. It's a witness. It's a documentary witness to the making and the existence of the treaty, and so it contains. It actually contains parts of the treaty itself. Right,
and that's the tie-in to his springboard from chapter 2. Right, is he was talking about the covenants as witness documents.
Mm-hmm.
To the covenant ceremony itself.
Right, exactly. That's going back to that section that he alluded to on page 72,
mm-hmm.
where he says, like the covenant narrative in the Pentateuch, that covenant narrative in the Gospels is chiefly concerned with the establishment of the covenant order. It is particularly in their dominant interest in the sacrificial death of Christ, the covenant mediator, that the Gospels show themselves to be primarily testimonies to the ratification of God's covenant. So the book of Exodus also would be a testimony to the ratification of God's covenant with Israel, the Sinai covenant.
And that really is the first area in which Kline sees a correspondence between Exodus and the Gospels, the New Testament Gospels, is this inauguration of the covenant.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, in fact, this is the first major correspondence between the Gospels and the book of Exodus, which is that the second half of each of these books, the second half of Exodus, the second half of the Gospels, is primarily focused on the events surrounding the actual inauguration or establishment of the covenant, depending on which covenant it is that's being inaugurated. Mm-hmm. So the second half of the Gospels is the inauguration of the New Covenant, and the second half of Exodus is the inauguration of the Sinaitic Covenant. And it's interesting, too, in this section here on page 178, Kline points out that they both have similar topography. I like how Kline thinks. He's a very visual, poetic thinker. You know, he mm-hmm. thinks in terms of the visual imagery here. So he's looking at the fact that there's this topography in both Exodus and the Gospels. So in the Gospels, you have this second half of the Gospels about the inauguration of the New Covenant is very much interested in these mountaintop episodes, because the inauguration of the covenant section of the Gospels begins with the Mount of Transfiguration, and then it goes to the cross and the resurrection, and it concludes with the ascension of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a similar thing with the book of Exodus, where you have the inauguration begins in chapter 19 with Israel at Mount Sinai, and then it concludes at the very end of Exodus 40, with what Kline calls the enthronement of the glory cloud in the tabernacle. And you might think, well, that's not a mountain per se, but if you think about it, what is the tabernacle? It's a replica of the heavenly mountain where God dwells. And so the coming of the glory cloud into the tabernacle is like the enthronement of the glory cloud on that mountain, just like the ascension of Christ.
Wow. And mountains seem to have really stood out to Kline as important features.
Right.
I know that both of us had him before he wrote God, Heaven, and Harmageddon, but he said more than once in his lectures that mountains are significant biblically because they tend to be where God does his covenant transactions with his people.
That's right.
So he's picking up on that even here in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mountains are ways of connecting heaven and earth.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he would tie that in with the whole ziggurat motif as well. That's why the Tower of Babel was a sacred mountain where man was trying to ascend to God, or to allow a place for the gods to descend to man. So mountains are very significant, not only in the ancient Near Eastern culture, but in biblical theology as well.
Very good.
And I think I mentioned too in a previous episode that Kline also talked a lot about the mountain called Saphon, which is another name for God's heavenly dwelling place. It can also be another name for Mount Zion, but Saphon was originally the name for the mountain where the Canaanite god Baal lived. So obviously God is greater than Baal. God he's the true God. The true Baal just means Lord. So he's the true Lord, of which the Canaanite Baal is a distorted replica. And so Mount Zion is the true mountain, of which Zaphon is a distorted replica.
Wow. That's helpful even apologetically.
Yeah. So yeah, just look in the Psalms where it talks about Mount Zion on the far north, Yarkde Zaphon, the heights of the north, the far north.
Okay.
So that's the first major correspondence, is seeing how both the book of Exodus and the Gospels have this second major half of the book that is focused on the inauguration of the covenant. The second major correspondence is looking at the first half of each book. And the first half of both Exodus and the Gospels is focused on the life of the individual, whether it's Jesus or Moses, who actually mediates the covenant mediator, who is the one through whom the covenant is put into effect.
Okay.
And so Kline points out that this provides the explanation for this unique quality that the Gospels have that created the problem, back when we were looking at what the scholars are trying to figure out when they're trying to determine the genre of the Gospels. How do you explain this combination of both narrative and discourse, of both history and law? And Kline says this is the explanation, because the covenant mediator is the focus of the first section, and therefore we need to not only know about his life and what he did, but we also need to know about his teaching and his words.
And he points out, this is one of those things that I thought was kind of granular but still interesting, is that you get in both Exodus and the Gospels a picture of the covenant mediator in childhood, and then you really don't get a biographical sketch again until adulthood. Right.
Yeah, a true biography would want to have more continuity, right, and try to find more explanation about his upbringing and his family and so on. Mm-hmm. But the Gospels aren't interested in that. The Gospels are only interested in the life of the covenant mediator to the extent that it relates to his work of inaugurating the covenant. And so that's why the Gospels just, aside from that one really brief episode related in the Gospel of Luke, when he was about 12 years old and he was in the temple, aside from that, the Gospels are pretty much just glossing over everything after his birth up until his baptism.
Right. So, in terms of both Exodus and the Gospels explaining the mediatorial role of Moses and Jesus, we end up getting the threefold offices involved in both figures, right? The prophet, priest, and king.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a neat little section here on page 179 where Kline draws out the threefold offices or the threefold office of the covenant mediator. And he points out that a priest is someone who officiates at the covenant ratification ceremony. A king is someone who rescues God's people from their enemies. And a prophet is someone who conveys the words of the Lord's covenant to his people. And so you see all three of those offices. Obviously, you see them in Christ, but interestingly, you also see them in Moses himself. We tend to think of Moses as just being a prophet.
Right.
But we also see the priestly and the kingly element in him as well. He's the priest because he officiates at the covenant ratification ceremony, and he's a king because he's the deliverer that God raised up to rescue his people from their enemies.
That is a fascinating parallel.
Yeah, I mean, the way I kind of view it, I don't know if Kline would say this, but I kind of view it as like a stem cell, you know? And stem cells, as they develop, they will then differentiate, and this stem cell will become a muscle cell, and that stem cell will become a heart cell, and so on. But at the beginning, stem cells are just sort of this one undifferentiated thing. And I kind of view Moses as a stem cell because he has all three of these offices in him. And then, of course, as covenant history progresses, we'll start to see, well, no, Moses is going to be replaced by distinct covenant officers. And so you'll have the priests through Aaron and his sons, and you'll have the kings through David and his sons. And God's going to raise up prophets who are not genealogical, but he's going to raise up prophets along the way. And so there'll be three distinct offices. But at the beginning here, it almost seems like Moses has all three within himself.
So then, in addition to seeing prophet, priest, and king in both Moses and Jesus, would we compare primarily the Sermon on the Mount to Moses' giving of the law?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And Kline's going to bring that out when we get into the next section on Moses typology.
Okay.
And he's going to say, that the Sermon on the Mount is, it's hard not to see the parallels with Moses there, right? He goes up on a mountain,
right,
and then he gives the new law, the law of Christ. So there's a lot of parallels there.
That's why I said primarily. I mean, obviously, Jesus teaches in many other contexts, but it seems to be the most obvious parallel there on the mountain.
Yeah.
Well, especially when Jesus is taking up certain of the Mosaic laws in his discourse.
He's explicitly bringing them up and saying, "You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you."
Right.
And he's also connecting his law to the Mosaic law by saying, "Don't think that I came to abolish the Mosaic law, for I came not to abolish, but to fulfill." So he's not saying, "Okay, I'm just Xing out Moses and giving you a brand new law that has nothing to do with Moses." He's saying, "My law is the fulfillment of the law of Moses."
Right.
And then you have at the very end, right? The crowds were amazed because he spoke as one having authority and not as their scribes and Pharisees.
Sure. The scribes and Pharisees would have just been giving commentary on Moses.
Yeah, their job is just to be exegetes of what Moses said.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus comes along and says, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. And so he speaks with direct authority and as the lawgiver of the new covenant people of God.
Right. But so we've been looking at similarities between the two, but what stands out about the Gospels?
Well, there are some distinctive things in the Gospels, and Kline will mention some of those on page 180. He points out, for example, that the Gospels have a distinctive Christological perspective. So obviously that's something that is unique because the Gospels are focused upon not a type of the Messiah, but on the Messiah himself, the reality. And so the Gospels are going to be proclaiming to us who the Messiah is in his fullness, in his work, in his saving power, in a way that totally transcends what Moses was about. He also points out that even within the four Gospels, there are distinctives because each of the four Gospels has their own distinctive points that they are trying to make. And so, for example, Matthew and Luke, they have genealogies and they narrate the birth of the covenant mediator, whereas Mark and John, they begin their gospels differently. So Mark begins with the baptism of Jesus, and the Gospel of John begins back at the beginning. In the beginning, Genesis 1:1, and shows us the ontological deity of the Son. So each gospel has distinctive things that they're trying to communicate, so that even though they are all in some way shaped by and influenced by the book of Exodus, yet they're also containing some unique perspectives too.
Okay.
And then Kline wraps up this section here by giving a definition on page 181, his definition of what is a gospel. He says, a gospel is a document that has as its literary center of gravity an account of the inauguration of a divine covenant set within a record of the covenant mediator's career and of the law of the community promulgated by the mediator.
Okay. So history and law.
Right.
Okay.
But the center of gravity is on the inauguration of the covenant. Whether it's, Exodus 19 to 24, the Sinaitic covenant, or whether it's the new covenant established in Christ's blood, and focusing on the passion narratives.
So both of those narrative elements in each one would be the center of gravity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then the next section that he moves into is Moses-Exodus typology in the Gospels.
Right. So here, he wants to show us something interesting. He's basically arguing that you can see that the Gospels are influenced by the book of Exodus because of the way that they present the saving acts of Christ as a new Exodus led by a new Moses.
Okay.
So he wants to show us then and here we're not gonna dwell on these, but we'll just list them off kind of like bullet points. But he's going to show us all the Exodus typology, that is all the things in the Gospels where you see the work of Christ being described as a new Exodus. And then he's going to also get into the Moses typology, all the things in the Gospels where you see Christ being presented as the new Moses.
Okay.
So we'll start off with the Exodus typology. The first most obvious point is that the word Exodus is actually used in the Gospels, at least once, in Luke 9:31. This is the account that Luke is giving of the transfiguration of Jesus. And let me just pull up the text there and read it for you. He says, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his Exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. The word Exodus is an ambiguous word. It could mean Exodus in the sense of harking back to the coming out of the people of Israel, ex out and hodos way, so the way out of the people of Israel. But it can also just mean departure in the sense of death. So I think that Kline is arguing that it has a double meaning there. They're speaking of the departure of Jesus, that is his death. But Luke uses this word Exodus because it has this other meaning as well, so that the departure of Jesus, the death of Jesus, is being viewed as the new Exodus.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, let's be honest, Kline was fond of his double meanings.
Oh, yeah. His double entendre. Yeah, actually, that's a good point to bring out, which is if you look at a lot of Kline's journal articles, he'll use double meanings in his articles a lot.
Right.
Like the end of the millennium. Does that mean the end of the millennial period, or does that mean the end of millennial thinking? Probably both. Okay, so let's just go through some of these. So the other element here that points to Exodus typology is the fact that the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples coincides with the Passover.
Right.
So the Last Supper is a Passover meal, and so that's pretty explicit. You have the fact that John the Gospel of John refers to Jesus as the Lamb of God, alluding to the Passover lamb, John 1:29.
Right.
There is the use of the word redemption or redeem, found mostly in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 1:68, 2:38, 21:28, 24:21. So the use of the word redemption obviously goes back to Exodus, because that's what God did, is he redeemed his people out of slavery and brought them into the freedom of being God's people. You have the reference to this deliverance of God's people from their oppression as something that takes place in fulfillment of God's prior covenant promise that he made to Abraham. So Luke says that explicitly in Luke 1:68 to 74, but that parallels a similar statement in the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 2, verses 22 to 24, where God says that he remembered his covenant with Abraham,
right,
and delivered them. Exodus 2, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So the remembrance of the covenant, and Luke uses the same verb, to remember his covenant, in Luke 1.
The same verb, you mean that would have been in the Septuagint?
I didn't actually check that, but it could be.
Okay.
I'm just going on the basis of the English use of the word remember.
Got it. Okay.
There's also the reference to the Jubilee. Remember in Luke 4, when Jesus quotes from Isaiah to preach good news to the captives and all that.
Right.
He says, today this prophecy has been fulfilled. And so, of course, we know that the Jubilee in the Old Testament was a symbol of redemption from slavery. And so the fact that Luke is making that connection, putting it on the mouth of Jesus and saying that Jesus is the one who proclaims the true Jubilee.
Okay.
We can't forget the fact that the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is interpreted explicitly in the Gospels as a covenantal transaction.
Right.
Referring, the blood of the new covenant, referring to Exodus 24, that uses that same phrase as well. So when Jesus was with his disciples in the upper room, and he was, breaking the bread and so on, he says that this cup is the new covenant in my blood, alluding to Exodus 24. Another interesting point is that the Last Supper itself is a communion meal, which ties back to Exodus 24 as well, because after Moses sprinkled the blood of the covenant upon the people, then we're told that the elders of Israel went up and they had a communion meal with God on the mountain.
So the Last Supper fulfills typology from two different episodes in Exodus then.
Yeah, isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
Not only the Passover, but also the communion meal in Exodus 24. So that's kind of an interesting thing.
It is.
Which makes you wonder, doesn't it, that is there a connection between the communion meal in Exodus 24 and the Passover?
Right.
In Exodus 12. Seems like there is a tie there.
Yeah. That would be interesting to explore sometime.
Yeah. And then lastly, another Exodus motif in the Gospels is all the references to the wilderness. So Jesus was tempted by the devil in the wilderness, and he fed the multitudes in the wilderness. Of course, that alludes to the way Moses fed Israel,
right,
when they were in the wilderness with the manna. And John 6 explicitly connects that and said, has Jesus saying that just as Moses gave you manna, so I also am giving you the true bread, the bread from heaven.
And what about the temptation?
Well, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness harks back to the fact that Israel was tested in the wilderness.
Okay, the testing.
Yeah, and the fact that Jesus, when he is confronted by the devil, he quotes from the book of Deuteronomy. And, man shall not live by bread alone,
right,
but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And so by quoting from Deuteronomy, he is pretty clearly identifying himself as the true Israel. Of course, he passes the test where Israel failed.
Right. Wow, that's rich. Okay, so that covers the typology of the Exodus in the Gospels. Now, what about the typology of Moses in the Gospels?
Here we have a whole bunch of similarities. You have the birth narratives of both. Exodus starts off with the birth narrative of Moses, just as Matthew and Luke do. You also have the fact that there's often an episode from the early life of the covenant mediator that gives you a clue as to his future role. When Jesus is in the temple, discussing theology with the rabbis, and when Moses rises up to kill the Egyptian who was persecuting the Israelites. And in both cases, the people around failed to grasp the significance of what they did.
Right.
So, Mary and Joseph don't understand what Jesus is doing. Why did you, go off and leave us here? We were worried about you. And the Israelites also don't understand what Moses did. And yet both of these events are giving you a little glimpse, a little foretaste of what's to come.
Okay. And
you have the miracles of Jesus and Moses that they perform, which are not just miracles in and of themselves with no significance, but rather they are miracles that have sign significance to them. So the judging of the waters of the Nile, right, is significant because the Nile was the source of life for the Israelites. And same with the miracles of Jesus. He doesn't just do miracles as an end in themselves, but he heals, he casts out demons. He's seeking and saving the lost.
Right. And you've got, we've talked about intrusion in the last episode. You've got the eschaton involved in his miracles and signs as well.
Very good. I like that. Yeah. You're seeing a little bit of a foretaste of the new creation breaking in.
Right.
When he raises the dead and heals the sick. And the same with Moses. You're seeing a breaking in of the day of judgment.
I would commend Herman Ridderbos's The Coming of the Kingdom for seeing more of that in the Gospels.
Oh, yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah.
I really love that book by Ridderbos.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just keep going here with some more Moses typology. Okay. Like Moses, Jesus was rescued from hostile forces, referring to in their infancy. You had Pharaoh and Herod both trying to kill him.
Right.
Like Moses, Jesus delivered the people from bondage to diabolical powers. Now that's obvious with Jesus because he's casting out demons and plundering the strong man's house. But what about Moses? Well, Kline would say that when God was judging Pharaoh, God was also judging the gods of Egypt.
Oh,
and
okay.
The gods of Egypt are obviously demons.
It sort of sets Pharaoh up as a devil character too, though, doesn't it?
It sort of does, yeah. You sort of have that idea, right, that he's this prince of darkness who's holding the people captive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
The stilling of the storm in the Gospels recalls the crossing of the Red Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And then here Kline has a little aside where he brings out the idea of the water ordeal, and he connects that to obviously the Red Sea, but also to the baptism of Jesus, which is another episode that recalls the crossing of the Red Sea, leading the people through the sea of death into resurrection life.
Okay.
We're just ticking these things off quickly, so each one of these could occupy us in much more detail, but Absolutely. We're just going to run through them. Like Moses, Jesus is depicted as a shepherd.
Right.
Like Moses, Jesus fed the people of God in the wilderness.
Yep.
Like Moses, Jesus is a priestly mediator. Moses interceded to spare the people from judgment. Like Moses, Jesus inaugurated the covenant and founded the kingdom.
Right.
Like Moses, Jesus promulgated the law of the kingdom. Sermon on the Mount. Like Moses, the transfiguration of Jesus transpired on the mountain, enveloped by the theophanic glory cloud. I thought that was insightful.
Yeah.
You know, because Moses was also transfigured in a way. When he went up on the mountain, his face glowed with the glory cloud.
That's right. That's right. He came down and the people couldn't even look at him.
Yeah. And it happened on the mountain. So that's very interesting.
And, I mean, Moses appears in Jesus' Mount of Transfiguration as well.
Right. Exactly. And Elijah was taken up in the chariots of fire. So I wonder if that's sort of like a transfiguration being enveloped by a glory cloud thing too.
Interesting.
It's Elijah. Going through, I mean, that right there would be a great little thing to study more, but we don't have time. Let's go next to this reference here that Kline makes to the Gospels present Jesus as the servant of the Lord that is prophesied in the book of Isaiah.
Okay.
And you're saying, wait, how is that Moses typology? Well, Isaiah's picture of the servant of the Lord is based on Moses.
Okay. The paradigm servant.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Who was not always wildly accepted by the people.
Right. Oh, isn't that interesting? Both rejected by the people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another point is the fact that you have the 12 tribes of Israel, which are paralleled by the 12 apostles.
Right.
That Jesus gathers around himself, showing that he's gathering a remnant, which is going to constitute the beginnings of the new Israel, which is the church. The Sermon on the Mount, quote, which epitomizes Jesus' authoritative teaching role, recalls unmistakably the figure of Moses at Mount Sinai. I think that's critical because it helps us to understand that, you know, as Christians, we're not bound by the law of Moses directly as Moses gave it. We're bound by the moral law as given to us by Christ, the new Moses. We're bound to the law of Christ.
Oh, that's very interesting.
You know, Paul uses that statement in Galatians 6:2.
The law of Christ.
Yeah. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ.
Well, and that even comes out, as you pointed out earlier, when Jesus says, "But I say to you," right?
That's right.
It's just a greater, eschatologized law?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just as authoritative, right? I mean, Christ himself is God, so it is the law of God.
Sure.
It has the same authority, but it's from Christ. It's not from Moses. And of course, there's tons of continuity, right? I mean,
absolutely.
The moral law doesn't change, and Christ repeats, you know, large swaths of the Mosaic teaching, but it's coming from his hand and from his authority. We also have the farewell discourse of Jesus in John 13 through 17, which Kline thinks is an echo of the farewell discourse of Moses in Deuteronomy. Even looking ahead to, you know, when I'm gone, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
And so, of course, with Christ, he's focusing on the role of the Spirit, the Comforter who's going to come and who's not going to leave us as orphans, but who's going to minister to us all that we have in Christ and to lead us into all truth.
Now, that does reach outside of Exodus, but the same author.
Right.
So, okay, carry on.
That was a good point, though. And then we also have the fact that in both the book of Exodus and in the New Testament, you have this pattern where after Satan is defeated, then we have the building of the sanctuary. We talked about this in a few episodes prior. I think it was part 1, chapter 3, if I recall. This pattern of the conflict with the chaos monster leading to the building of the sanctuary for the God to take up his residence.
Right.
But you see that basic pattern in the book of Exodus. You have the defeat of Satan, which we already mentioned is basically Pharaoh, and then you have the building of the sanctuary at the end of Exodus. And at the very end, Exodus 40, the glory cloud comes and is enthroned within the sanctuary. And so Kline sees a similar pattern in the Gospels as well as the first 2 chapters of Acts. So he sees the conflict with Satan in the cross. Well, obviously you have, all the casting out of demons, binding the strong man, defeating Satan in the cross, then the resurrection and ascension of Christ. Then he pours out the Spirit in Acts 2. So now we're going outside of the boundaries of the Gospels, but it's for Luke's Gospel, it's just the next couple chapters. And so this idea of the church being the new sanctuary, the new tabernacle, and the Spirit coming and dwelling within the church.
Wow. But I mean, in defense of making that connection and, maybe going outside of the Gospels, you do have a continuation of the gospel narrative, right? I mean, Acts starts off with the ascension.
Right.
And so we're still in the story that the Gospels were telling when Acts, is relaying this information.
Right.
So,
and as I mentioned already, it's part of Luke's 2-volume series. He's got his Gospel and then the book of Acts, which just continues that.
Okay.
So having said all that, those are all the parallels that Kline lists. But then having said all that, Kline also wants to make very clear that Jesus is greater than Moses.
Right.
He says, finally, there are new Exodus elements in the Gospels in which Jesus is presented not as a new Moses, but as one who utterly transcends Moses. So, Moses is the leader and the people are following him, but Jesus himself is the way, right?
Right.
Or, Moses provides the manna from heaven, but Jesus himself is the true bread from heaven.
Mm-hmm. If you believed Moses, you would believe me.
Yeah. Moses offers a sacrifice to inaugurate the covenant, Exodus 24, the blood of the covenant, but Jesus himself is the sacrifice.
Right.
So it's just all these ways in which you see how, although there are parallels, yet you don't want to just make it seem as though Jesus is sort of Moses 2.0 or Moses redivivus, Moses, raised from the dead. No, he's much greater than Moses. He is not only like Moses, but he is the transcendent fulfillment of Moses that shatters everything that Moses pointed to in such a small way.
Exactly. Moses was just the diorama.
Yeah.
Jesus is the thing that the diorama was a model of.
When Moses raises his staff to part the waters of the Red Sea, he's not doing that as the creator who has power over the water. He's doing that only as a servant of God. He's a mere man. But when Christ stills the storm, he does so as the creator himself.
That's right. What about the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another indicator of the transcendence of Christ, that he utterly transcends Moses.
Those are great. And a good note for Kline to wrap up that typology with.
Yeah. So having gone through all of this Exodus typology and Moses typology, Kline points out, look, this doesn't prove that the Gospels are modeled on the genre of Exodus, because after all, you've got Exodus typology in other parts of the New Testament too, like the book of Revelation. But that doesn't mean Revelation is part of the Exodus genre.
Right.
But he says it does suggest that the Gospel writers were aware that they were standing in the line of the covenantal tradition of the book of Exodus.
Okay, so sort of like we've talked about Paul having an awareness of the covenant format.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then on pages 195 through 203, he talks about the canonical function of the gospel genre. And we've already covered canon and covenant, but now how does gospel genre fit into that?
We can just simply summarize it very clearly here and just say that the gospel genre is that it's a legal witness to the covenant.
Okay.
And so the purpose of these documents, whether it's the book of Exodus or the Gospels, is to provide a documentary attestation to the making of the covenant. And I think it's kind of cool here that he says, notice how you have a doubling. In the book of Exodus, you have two tables, that is, two copies of the treaty, and they are inserted within the Ark of the Covenant. But in the New Testament, you have four Gospels. So 2 times 2 is 4. So the doubling of the witness. This just makes it even more secure. This just adds absolute, confirmation to the attestation of this covenant. Another interesting implication of this is that Kline points out that, I mentioned at the very beginning that this whole study of trying to understand the genre of the Gospels and then seeing it as tied to the book of Exodus is very useful, because it brings out it sheds some light on the nature and purpose of the Gospels. And one of the cool things that he sees here is that he sees the Gospels as being primarily for the church, not for the world.
Right.
I'll quote here. He says, page 197, "It is not a witness to the world, but to the church, the community of God's covenant people. It is not a charismatic, but a legal witness. Not charismatic evangelistic proclamation of Jesus Christ, but legal attestation to God's covenant." Now, I mean, he might be going a little bit too far there to say it's not witness, but covenant attestation, because I think you could say that there probably is a evangelistic element as well. But I think so instead of saying it's not that, but it's only this, I think we might want to say there's both there. But I do think that it's really interesting that by looking at the book of Exodus as the background, this helps to shed light on an aspect of the Gospels that could be easily missed.
Right. Maybe we could say that the primary purpose to draw on Kline again is to address the church.
Right.
But it certainly has effects for the world.
Yeah.
So.
And it gives instruction to us as the church about how we should proclaim the gospel to the world.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that's really helpful. And when you think about the Gospels, you think of all the things that are in there that are still so highly relevant for us today. We go to the Gospels for Jesus' teaching on marriage and divorce. We go to the Gospels, especially the Sermon on the Mount, for Jesus' teaching on how we should relate to the world and turning the other cheek, and just all these different things, loving your enemies. There's so much instruction that is there, that is given to us as God's people, as the new covenant people of God, that we need to look to, and we need to realize, look, this is our marching orders,
Right.
The Great Commission. All these things are there for us to tell us what we are to be and to do as God's covenant people.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think we often tend to look at the epistles as the primary place to find the covenant instruction for God's people.
True.
But we also need to look at the Gospels. Of course, you have to be careful how you interpret those things, because there are some unique elements in the Gospels that have to do with that particular point in redemptive history prior to the death and resurrection of Christ, right? You don't want to take what Jesus said in Matthew 23, where he said that the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat and that we should do everything that they say, but not what they do. Obviously, we shouldn't do that.
Right.
But so there are certain things in the Gospels that are only for that time. But nevertheless, there are also broader swaths of teaching that are transcending that time and that go into the church age, and that should govern how we live and how we function in the church and in the world. Right.
And I mean, which Christian can miss the authority there? Not that the epistles have any less authority. I mean, they are still part of the New Covenant treaty document as a whole. But I mean, here is the covenant Lord himself giving us this instruction.
That's right. So. And Paul even recognized that distinction, even though Paul was an apostle and he had authority as an apostle to instruct the church. Nevertheless, he did recognize the distinction between his own teaching and that of Christ himself. He says, 1 Corinthians 7:10, to the married, I give this charge, parentheses, not I, but the Lord. And then verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord.
Interesting. Yeah, he was willing to parse that out.
Yeah. And so we see the lordship of Christ over his covenant community, just as you see the lordship of Yahweh, at Mount Sinai over Israel as a nation. In the Gospels, you're seeing Christ as the suzerain. He's the Lord, and he's revealing his covenant to us. And so this really gives an interesting, very high Christology, where you see Christ himself as Kyrios, as Lord.
Right.
That's the Greek translation of Yahweh in the Old Testament. So it's a very interesting connection there. In fact, Kline even brings that out. He talks about what he calls the covenantal orientation given to Christology in the Gospels. So the Gospels are about Christology. They're telling you about who Christ is. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of Man, all these things. But it's all within a covenantal context because it's revealing the suzerain of the covenant.
Right. Which is another aspect of how he's greater than Moses. I mean, Moses was the mediator that God appointed to mediate the old covenant. The Lord himself is the mediator,
right,
in the new covenant.
And then just to wrap things up here, Kline also has an interesting little discussion about the meaning of the word gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that we have to understand the gospel in light of two other concepts, kingdom and covenant.
Okay.
So he says the gospel is the gospel of the kingdom. And here he's quoting from Matthew. Matthew uses that phrase, Matthew 4:23 and 9:35 and 24:14. So what is the gospel of the kingdom? Well, it's the announcement of the good news that the kingdom has come. But then we also have to tie the gospel to the covenant, because what is the covenant? Well, it's a divine or sovereign administration of the kingdom of God.
Right.
So if you want to understand the meaning of the word gospel, you have to tie it to the concept of kingdom and the concept of covenant, and say that since the Gospels, the four Gospels, are all about the ratification of the new covenant, that's what the gospel is. It's the good news that God, through this covenant, is administering the kingdom.
There you have it.
So I think that's such a robust definition of gospel that is really helpful and just brings out so much to it and connects the Gospels, the four Gospels, to the rest of Scripture in a way that is so much more thick and substantial.
Right. I like what he says on page 200 in this regard. He says, to say the New Testament Gospels testify to the ratification of the new covenant is tantamount to saying that they declare the arrival of the age of God's kingdom.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exciting because this is the arrival of the age of God's kingdom in a way that Israel could only see faintly. Mm-hmm. So, but we've got the substance in Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm. You know, another really cool thing about this is that when you look at the four Gospels, you just think in your mind's eye, right? What are the four Gospels all about? You think of these terms like gospel and kingdom, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't really think that much about the term covenant, because the word covenant doesn't occur all that often. It does occur, you know, at that very climactic point at the Last Supper, right? Where he says, this blood is the new covenant in my blood. But that's about it. You don't really see covenant plastered throughout. Right. Unlike the word gospel and unlike the word kingdom, which is throughout. But what's really great about what Kline is getting at here is when you see this whole Exodus context to the four Gospels, and you see all this Exodus typology and all this Moses typology, then suddenly you realize, wait a minute, the Gospels are about the covenant. Even though the word is only used at that one point at the very end, suddenly it's like, wow, the Gospels are very covenantal.
Yes.
Everything is, covenant is like the whole atmosphere of the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. And it really takes that biblical theological analysis of the parallels to see that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, all right. Anything else to say as we wrap up here?
Well, we could go on.
Oh, absolutely.
We could look at each one of those detailed Exodus and Moses typologies, but I think that we've given a good overview here, and I think it's just really encouraging to get us to dig more deeply into the Gospels and to really to read them in a new light from this covenant angle. Right.
If our listeners are now motivated to go and read the Gospels side by side with Exodus, then what a great thing we've accomplished.
That'd be great.
Yes.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Lee, for that great discussion. Really appreciate it. And
thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Please let us know what you think, emailing us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can also tweet us at glorycloudpod on Twitter. Take care, and we will see you next week.